If you are an entrepreneur, I've got to tell you, building a relationship to and with grief is so important in entrepreneurship. And I don't think we talk enough about it. And that can be a problem because it can really sneak up on you and you're like, what is occurring? What is happening? And not necessarily know what's happening, but like how to deal with it, how to react to it, how to take care of yourself through it. And the reason for the importance of building an intentional and conscious relationship to grief as an entrepreneur is because your business is going to evolve and shift as you evolve and shift as its leader. This is especially true if you are still really close to the business, right? You may even be working in it, right? In my work with entrepreneurs, in my own personal, journey and my own experience with entrepreneurship, I've realized that it's a series of deaths and rebirths. That means that it's inevitable that there's going to be an ending or loss. And depending on your relationship with grief, with endings, with loss, that can feel really uncomfortable. It can feel really destabilizing. You just might find yourself like having these feelings and these experiences and not knowing what to make of them, how to name them. And that can be really destabilizing. When I think about my career trajectory from working in education policy to being a teacher and school leader to pivoting to mental health and now working as a coach, when I think back to that, right, the catalyst for every single pivot was the death of a former version of me. And I didn't know it then, but when I think back to what happened, right, like what was like the trigger event, what was the trigger point that caused me to make that pivot, it was that. It was an ending. And kind of another way to think about it is like my preferences and my desires were being updated. If you think about like updating a phone, the version that your phone is operating on just no longer works, right? It starts glitching, it slows down, all of the things. Like it's the same exact idea here. In the last pivot that I made, I found myself feeling so disconnected from my business. But interestingly, I did not feel disconnected from the work that I was doing. This is a realization that I kind of had after the fact, but that disconnection was incredibly, incredibly uncomfortable. When I look back at that time, it makes so much sense because my first business was created in the image of who I was then. And being in that space of disconnection was just so uncomfortable. Like, I just cannot underscore that feeling and that experience, especially as someone, I'm a generator, I'm double Sagittarius, like I'm very clear, I'm visionary, like I know where I want to go. I know how to get there. I know how to get the resources, who to tap into, right? So that I can get there. Sitting in this kind of like liminal funky gray space is like I kind of felt like I was in quicksand. Like I couldn't find the grounding. I couldn't move forward. And for someone like me, that's really hard. That was really, really, really hard. I had so many thoughts running through my mind. And there was one that just kept coming up over and over and over again. And that was like, Josie, things are going well. You're making good money. Like financially, things are solid. Impact wise, you're in alignment with your mission, you're in alignment with your purpose, like you're helping transform people's lives. Like, why are you trying to change things? It's kind of the idea behind if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I had this realization that things don't have to be broken for them to be out of alignment. Struggle, pain, strife, these things are not prerequisites for change. You can just know that it's time for a change, right? Like you don't always need hard evidence in the form of loss of revenue or firing a team member or anything that kind of feels like really heavy like that. Your inner knowing can be the quote unquote hard evidence, but we all know that that's not always how things work. And so, in that discomfort, I was really invited to get curious about my relationship to grief and loss because I knew that an ending was coming, but because I really hadn't thought critically or been really intentional about this relationship with endings and grief and loss. I was unwell, very much unwell, very confused. And so I started to see that what was underneath my discomfort was really my fear of letting go of what I built. And if I got one layer deeper, it was this idea that if I let it go or if I didn't allow it to morph into something else, somehow I was lessening its importance. I was lessening its value, almost like the work that I had put into it was going to go to waste. Like, wild. That's not at all what happens when you intentionally and thoughtfully decide to end something or to leave something, or, as I mentioned before, allow something to just organically morph into the next thing that it's supposed to morph into. It was this idea of seasonality, right? That just like seasons in nature, right? Like seasons change, they change. One season ends and another one begins. That was exactly what was happening. And I had to really shift my thinking and really again be really critical about kind of these beliefs and this like the inner critic in me coming up and like all of these thoughts to like really get to this place that allowed me to kind of see things for what they were, right? Like I didn't have to attach this negative meaning to the fact that things were shifting, to the fact that things were ending. It was like I shared in another episode, it's about acceptance. Here's where we are, and how can we see what's in front of us for what it actually is. I was kind of going back to this idea of like a series or like a cycle of death and rebirth. At that time I was on the death side of the cycle, right? And things needed to happen there so that I could make it and allow myself to get on the other side, right? Like on the rebirth side. And not coincidentally, because you already know how these things go, around this time my grandmother, my late grandmother, was transitioning from this realm, and I knew that this was kind of coming, and it was, I just knew what she was doing and kind of what was happening, even though no one kind of sat me down and said, hey, your grandmother's transitioning. I just kind of like knew that was the process that was like unfolding before me. And having the honor and having the privilege of being around when this was happening was, like most things, it was kind of like a parallel process to what was happening for me professionally. With my grandma, I decided, I was really intentional about giving myself permission to make that transition, to make that time what I wanted it to be. I knew that sadness was going to be par for the course, right? Like I knew that my grandmother was going to transition. I knew that there was going to come a time really soon that she would not be here. But I wanted it to be more than that. She was more than that, right? Her legacy was more than that. So I could and I did make it a time of honoring her, right? Of celebrating her, of listening to all of her stories, right? Even when it was like the seventh time, she was telling me the same story, the same stories. It was really about reflecting on all of the great times that we had. She was a primary caregiver for me when I was a kid. And that was really beautiful. And I was able to hold that like intentionally curated experience in time, but the sadness, right? And the pain. And that really sucked. Like endings don't feel good. Like there's really no way to like slice that. Like you can't bypass that. Like they don't feel good. Right. But you can still experience beauty even in that. And that's what I did with my grandmother. And so having gone through that experience personally with my abuela allowed me and gave me permission to do the same with my business and that business pivot that I was in the middle of during that time. And I grieved, y'all. I grieved for a while. right? I really grieve for that version of my business. I grieve for that version of me that created that business. As I reflect back, I can see that that process, parts of it did suck, right? That process really allowed me to see myself fully. I was able to see the version of Josie that created that version of my business. I was able to see what my motivators were then and how much they had changed, right? I was able to see how much I had changed and why this version was wanting to create something different, right? Something that felt different. It was a really tender process. I'll say that. And I think that sometimes we don't really equate the word tender with entrepreneurship, but it was such a beautifully tender process for me. It's almost like little Josie showed up a lot in that process. And it was really wonderful and cool to be able to show up for her as my adult version, right? And so to wrap up here, I want to invite you to get really curious about your relationship to grief and loss. In order to do so, as usual, I want to offer some reflection questions, just some reframes that can help you kind of explore this relationship. And so, one question is, what is your earliest memory of loss? And that could be a toy, a stuffed animal, a pet, a person. Like, what is your earliest memory of losing something, of an ending of some sort? The second question is, how did your parents, caretakers, community, the people who were around you, how did they speak to you about this particular, like your earliest memory of loss, or just about loss and grief generally? Think about the words that they used, right? If there were any rituals that took place. And the third question is, how do you react when you feel like you're about to lose something or an ending or change is on the horizon? We all have kind of our go to strategies. Okay. Some of us will hold on tightly, like white knuckle grip, like a lot of anxiety and fear comes up. Like, I am not trying to lose this thing. And sometimes people can be really ambivalent about it, right? It's this idea of like, well, what's the point? I'm going to lose it anyway. What's the point to even try to hold on to it? I think that this particular question can really support you when it comes to self inquiry and really allow you to see yourself and kind of why you do what you do and like how you do it. Okay. What I want you to understand clearly, whether you listen to the whole episode, whether you're reflecting on one of these questions, all of these questions, none of these questions, is that in the absence of intentionally curating your relationship to and with loss, grief, endings, you prevent evolution. You prevent your evolution. You prevent the evolution of your business, which then obviously translates to, being the bottleneck in your soul's purpose and your business's mission, right? It gets in the way of the things and the people that need to come in. All right, y'all. I hope that was helpful. I'll catch y'all next week.